This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of September 2nd, 2024. I'm Matt Moscardi. On today's countdown, CFOs stay hot. Starbucks poached a burrito. Southwest gets a special meeting. Women and black men are finally winning less. And on our first big vote of the season, it's at Big Cereal, General Mills. Let's start with our trade wire. Just some highlights from the executive trades. Big news was at Starbucks as Brian Niccol took the reins from Laxman Narasimhan. It was announced on August 13th, effective September 9th. Melody Hobson, who's a board all-star according to our data, was demoted to lead independent director as Niccol secured himself both more money and power than Laxman as part of the deal. Niccol notified Chipotle, his ex-employer, of his decision to leave as their CEO on August 13th, the same day Starbucks announced he would join Starbucks. Chipotle's board of directors appointed Scott Boatwright, who was the COO, as interim CEO, effective immediately. Boatwright spent 18 years prior to that with Arby's. Jack Hartung at Chipotle was actually brought out of pre-retirement as part of the shuffle. He announced his retirement from Chipotle effective as of 2025, but he agreed to remain with Chipotle, quote, indefinitely as president of strategy, finance, and supply chain, whatever that is, to ensure a smooth transition. Indefinitely. An indefinite job. Poor guy, never going to get to retire. At Chipotle's board, Scott Maw actually took Melody Hobson's job, going from Chipotle's lead independent director to chair of the board. So poach one CEO and the race is on to secure the rest. Now you've got a new chair at Chipotle, and on August 22nd, the Compensation People and Culture Committee at Chipotle's board granted retention awards to the rest of the NEOs and some other executives in the form of restricted stock units. The retention awards have grant date values of $8 million for Boatwright and Hartung. So both are getting the exact same thing, despite one being the interim CEO. $7 million for Garner and Brandt, and a retention award of $3 million for Reimer and $1.5 million for Ms. McConnell. The awards vest if they get fired by a new executive brought into Chipotle. Meanwhile, Starbucks happily paid Brian Niccol to take over from Laxman, and they paid him significantly more. We actually covered that in a Business Pants earlier this week. In other news, Apple announced CFO Luca Maestri is out. Since no one can quit on the date they actually quit, Maestri's leave date is January 1st of 2025. As part of planned succession, Kevin Parekh, Apple's vice president of financial planning and analysis, will become CFO and join the executive team. Without saying the quiet part out loud, Tyson Foods appointed Kurt Callaway as the company's CFO. Callaway most recently served as the company's interim CFO since June of this year. He was interim CEO because young Nepo baby, John R. Tyson, was busy being a drunky bed sleeper and was cast out of the company. On August 19th, Lip-Bu Tan informed the board of directors of Intel he was resigning effective immediately. Tan said, quote, I am grateful for the opportunity to have served on the Intel board of directors. This is a personal decision based on a need to reprioritize various commitments, and I remain supportive of the company and its important work. What he didn't say was summed up in this headline: Intel board member Lip-Bu Tan resigns after alleged disagreements over management of the company. In fact, he was ignored for suggesting that they get rid of a significant amount of middle management, and he suggesting that the company was bloated and was having a hard time turning around. I guess it's a symptom of only having 8% influence on the board and no friends, according to our data. Finally, W.W. Granger has a new chief of human resources after Matthew Fortin left after less than a year with no reason given. The announcement actually says nothing, just that he left, that he's not there anymore. Maybe he lacked human resources. There are a bevy of other early pre-proxy season board announcements. And when I say announcements, I mean appointments. And when I say appointments, I mean the board chose their friends to join boards. But we're going to get into them as we go through proxy season. For now, let's jump to our proxy cage matches. First up in the proxy cage matches, Southwest Airlines fight with activist investor Elliott just reached a new level. Elliott now owns enough of the airline to trigger a special shareholder meeting, which is 10% of the shares. And those are shares. That's not economic exposure. That's shares. But they thread the needle and didn't trigger the poison pill, which was at 11.5% of the shares. That would have diluted them from having any power to call the meeting in the first place. I expect the special meeting to focus mostly on the fact that the board is old and they still adhere to a philosophy employed in 1994. They basically have not pivoted from the original philosophy and have underperformed for the most part, and never actually recovered from their giant holiday debacle of 2 years ago now. Intel is actually facing potential activists. They missed both top and bottom line estimates in Q2, and they issued really weak Q3 guidance. And they hired advisors from Morgan Stanley to prepare for potential battles with activist investors. You don't usually read a headline that says company expects activists and they're hiring advisors to prepare against them. But at this point, there are no current activists there. Dan Loeb took an activist stake in 2020, or a significant stake in 2020. But I suppose this is linked to Lip Bhutan, who just quit. And one of your board members quits saying this company's bloated and run badly. You run some risk that they may talk to somebody, I suppose. So it looks like a preventative measure is being taken against activists here. No word yet what that will be, except Morgan Stanley is involved. In other news, it has not been a great few years for Richard Goyder, who was the chair of Qantas Airlines. At Qantas, he glass-cliffed his responsibility to a new female CEO after bilking customers. That CEO actually went out and apologized for, quote, everything. And that's real. She went out and said she was sorry for everything the company had done in its history. So talk about a glass cliff. He is also the chair at Woodside Petroleum, which is an oil and gas company. Market Forces, a climate activist, is agitating for board renewal there by targeting superannuation funds after Woodside put out a incredibly weak carbon strategy. So Goyder, not the favorite anymore in Australia, apparently. We're going to reach out to some of our Australian friends to see if there's anything more there. But finally, activist investor Ancora Holdings, fresh off its Norfolk Southern win, is urging Forward Air to launch a strategic review and consider a sale. And it warned that a board challenge might follow if investors' calls for actions are ignored. Let's move over to our vote results table. Just a couple of votes worth noting here. Dynatrace, both Jill Ward and Kristen Wahlberg got relatively significant votes against. Ward got 32% against and Wahlberg got 27% against. It's interesting because Dynatrace is a classified board, so the vote was actually against everyone any investor could vote against this year. And Ward and Wahlberg were also on the nominating committee to boot. No indication why exactly they were targeted. Microchip actually had a 17% for vote for a shareholder proposal put up by the Presbyterian Mission. The proposal requested a independent third-party report on whether or how to determine whether its customers' use of products actually linked to violations of international humanitarian law. In August of 2022, Royal United Services Institute and the Ukrainian government reported that Microchip's products were among the most prevalent in the 208 dual-use components recovered from 26 Russian weapons systems. Yes, Microchip's microchips are used in Russian weapons, and it still couldn't get more than 17% support for just a report on actually what weapons and how they're being sold. In other news, Ralph Lauren, Class A director Darren Walker was rejected, 53% against. They did vote out the black guy at the control company. It's unfortunate. Marathon Oil also at a special meeting on the merger with ConocoPhillips. Say-on-Pay was rejected, 58% against. You don't see that often, but that is an advisory vote anyway, so no word on whether that will affect actual say-on-pay. All right, enough of that. Let's get to the big vote. This week's big vote is at General Mills. The AGM is scheduled for September 24th. If you don't know who General Mills are, they're basically a Midwestern mafia company. They're Minnesota-based. They are the last mile delivery system for the Corn Industrial Complex. It's a snack cereal company. 51% of their sales are in snacks and cereal, which means most of what they do is marketing of snacks and cereal. In terms of market performance, 5-year TSR, they underperformed the S&P 500, 41% to 76%. 1 year underperformance versus the S&P, 12% to 24%. 3 months, they outperformed the S&P 10% to 3%, but it's not a company that's been sending home stellar returns relative to the market. They are a top-rated company by ESG for ESG performance, ESG metrics, according to MSCI. They are apparently pivoting. 41% of General Mills' global volume met their own criteria as nutrition-forward foods. Now, that's important. This is their own criteria. Nutrition-forward means it has 8 grams of whole grains, a half a serving of low or no-fat dairy, or a half a serving of fruit or nuts, according in anything. So you buy a snack bar, it says 1/2 serving fruit or equivalent, and they call it nutrition forward. Or if it meets federal regulations in the United States for, quote, implied nutrient content claims, meaning they say they have a nutrient, they actually have a nutrient, or if they say equivalent of a strawberry, that implied content claim meets a federal regulation. I'm not sure that qualifies as nutrition forward. Nutrition forward strikes me as actually maybe healthy, less refined, and that's not necessarily what they're saying. That's not what they're saying with their 41% of global volume. Their brands include things like Annie's Mac and Cheese, Betty Crocker, Bisquick, Bugles, Cheerios, Chex, Cinnamon Toast Crunch, Cocoa Puffs, which recently came under fire for they found heightened lead content in Cocoa Puffs, Cookie Crisp cereal, Fiber One, Green Giant, Jolly Green Giant, Kix, Haagen-Dazs, Lucky Charms, Trix, Wheaties. These are all cereals that you know if you're in the United States. But really the core question I had coming into this analysis of the board and how to tackle this AGM, their TSRs lagged. So not many people are happy, particularly with General Mills. But the way to increase the TSR has been sell more, and that's coming up against what is an obvious headwind of Ozempic and the and health and vegan movements in general. The greater inflation costs, on top of the fact that people don't want necessarily snack food all day. So that is the backdrop here. So let's get to the board. This board, you're buying a club. You're actually buying the conference board. Now, if you don't know what the conference board is, it's like the Business Roundtable in a lot of ways. There are a tremendous amount of connections. In fact, our data shows that there are 44 connections in the last 10 to 15 years of board members just on other boards. The major feeders, like go-betweens for board members on General Mills' boards in the last 10 to 15 years are Wells Fargo, FedEx, and Citi. This is not exactly a pantheon of well-run companies. FedEx is actually a voting member at the conference board, and so are several other companies. 15% of all the board connections in our database run through the conference board's voting members. The conference board is run by a man named Steve Odland, who is on this board. He's on the board of General Mills. Odland is not the most connected member through other boards. That goes to Kerry Clark, who just left the board this year. He had 7 connections to current and past directors. But Odland, Director Uribe, Mary Henry, Kim Godwin, they have 2 each. Odland and Sastra, who is the head of the nominating committee, they're both on the conference board currently. As a CEO and trustee of the conference board. So what you're getting out of General Mills is not food ag professionals necessarily. It's not scientists. It's not food engineers. You're not getting logistics and transportation professionals, because effectively what they're doing is they're taking things from one side of the agriculture ecosystem and delivering it to stores. You're not getting that. You're getting people who sit on the conference board, are members of the conference board, or know each other. In fact, the conference board is effectively sitting as the nominating committee. Odland himself has been on this board for 20 years. So you're getting a small club of directors, because the directors who aren't on the conference board are actually mostly local to the Midwest. This is another Midwest mafia company. It's located in Minnesota, but they've had directors from Target. They've had directors from who are based in Ohio, like Procter & Gamble, Sherwin-Williams. You're effectively getting either locals or the conference board. That's not a group of necessarily nutrition-forward thinkers. Now, I'm not saying they have no skills there, but let's get to their skills. They have put forward as one of their goals, as effectively their pivot, regenerative agriculture is a big part of the company's project to meet net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And it's a big part of what their focus for carbon footprint, but also nutrition. In fact, MSCI gives them top marks for product carbon footprint, meaning because they are doing things like including Scope 3 targets, and they have carbon programs at all of their facilities, including their fleets, they're getting top scores from other, ESG data providers. They have the Bell Institute, which is effectively what they named their internal nutrition division. They named it the Bell Institute to give it, I guess, some gravitas. And as one of the wins from the Bell Institute, they're including things like partnering with schools for breakfast by offering Trix cereal cups that have 25% less sugar. I'm not sure that that's really a selling point, considering Trix is basically like a bowl of diabetes, but 25% less sugar Trix is coming out of their Nutrition Institute, the Bell Institute. But at the board level, the skills on the board include very little to zero food skills. In fact, our knowledge map data suggests that food production represents just 1% of overall influence on the board, and only one director really has food production background, and that is the CEO himself. We saw the same exact dynamic unfold at Disney, where prior to the Nelson Peltz activist stance, Disney's board largely lacked commensurate media experience to Bob Iger. Bob Iger was the media experience. And when he left the board, there was almost none. Bob Chapek had parks experience, but not actually direct media experience. But that is a way, if you are an executive, you can consolidate power. Because if you're sitting in the room and somebody says, well, what are we doing about our nutrition forward strategy? What's our, only the CEO can really answer because they're the only one with food production experience. And we see this in the shareholder proposal this year. One of the shareholder proposals is about regenerative agriculture. And the response is effectively, well, the farmers can't do it. The farmers can't do what you're asking them to do. Who's going to challenge that? Is it the guy who worked at Nike? Is it the woman who worked in asset management? Or maybe their new director, Mauricus, who came from Sherman-Williams and has a business psychology background? There's no one on the board that can actually challenge that. And that's a problem, right? You have consolidated power with the CEO when it comes to core industry knowledge. But when it comes to other knowledge, even knowledge about things that if you're talking about a cereal snack company pivoting towards a greater nutrition, regenerative agriculture future, low carbon, less corn, more nutrients, that's the future. If your thesis on the world is that either is or has to be the future, this board does not have that as a background. What we see in actuality for this board is, in terms of skills, 19% of the influence comes from economics and accounting. 18% comes from mechanical. Mechanical usually involves working at companies where there's some process that is marketing or it's a form of administrative, right? Production and processing, only 4%. Food production, like I said, 1%. Transportation, 5% of the influence on the board. There is almost none of that. In fact, the transportation exposure that's on the board doesn't even come from logistics that matter to General Mills. It comes in the form of Sastra, Mary Sastra, who is the head of the nominating committee, whose background is in cruise companies and airlines. And she worked in the accounting and finance capacity at those companies. The head of the AARP is on this board. And now I'm not sure what that means now, except that she was at one point in government at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Jenkins. She was once upon a time on the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a senior in that department. But it's not really relevant, given that she's now the head of the AARP and has been there for a while, that you were once upon a time at the Department of Agriculture. So here's my final take, without belaboring it too much. This is a club board. 54% of the influence comes from connected directors, more if we include outside board interlocks. A CEO with sole knowledge of the core industry. Directors have experience on the margins, but nothing direct. They effectively treat this as sell, 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 not as pivot towards nutrition for the future. One director has 20-year tenured, and that director is the head of a major feeder system for this board at the conference board, which is a thought leadership, sort of business roundtable style committee. They have lagging TSR, a marketing focus to increase sales in the face of a possible health shift, and Ozempic. They're not planning for a future with less sugary cereals and pointless snacks. So I am suggesting this needs to be less of a retail board and more science and ag board and logistics. So my vote recommendation for the board is vote against Steve Odland. 20 years is enough. Target replacement should be someone with ag or ag science experience, some sort of ag background. But being on the General Mills board for 20 years and filling it with basically people that you know is not going to do it for the future. And vote against Mary Sastra. There are duplicative skills on accounting on the board already. You don't need those. Retail transportation isn't what you need. You need logistics and actual transportation, not cruises and airlines. A history in industries that have an overwhelming failure in environmental and forward thinking in airlines and cruises. And she's connected directly to Odland, given that she sits on the conference board trustee. She's one of the trustees of the conference board. So effectively what you're doing is breaking up the club. So those are my board recommendations. Let's move over to proposals. There's a say on pay proposal. 8% no in 2023. 16 million total for CEO Jeff Harmening. Here's one thing I got. We actually got a question from College Campus. Our intern Chantal, who's back at college, sent in a question about, she looked at this company and she had a question about the CEO pay ratio. Here's what she says. She says, she points out that General Mills says the ratio of our CEO's total compensation to median employees' total compensation was 228 to 1. She wanted to know, is that normal? Compared to other Fortune 500 companies, to an average business, is that normal? So here's what I did. I did some digging for you, Chantal. The median CEO pay ratio for the MSCI USA, which is effectively the S&P 500, give or take, was 186 to 1. So this is slightly above the median. The average is more like 250 to 1. The 90th percentile is 462 to 1. The 10th percentile was about 70 to 1. So is this normal? Yes. General Mills is in the 62nd percentile. This is totally normal. I mean, I don't know if you want your CEO to get that much relative to your, average employee or your median employee. But it is totally normal at this point compared to Fortune 500 companies, and not average businesses, but definitely Fortune 500 companies. So the answer to that question is yes, it's normal. In which case, when you look at the salary of Harmening, they're underperforming the S&P 500. If you just took this on a pure TSR basis, you should probably vote against pay, given that they are underperforming to S&P 500, but that's usually not the way it works. So what you're likely to see is he's getting about average. He's probably going to get paid. And these are advisory votes anyway. My recommendation is you vote against pay. I would recommend voting against pay in almost every circumstance anyway. But so take that with a grain of salt, but that would be my recommendation. Chantal actually had a second question as we get into other proposals. There's the auditor proposal, which KPMG has been the auditor since 1928. There's mixed arguments about how long is too long to be an auditor of a company. But nobody cares. This is going to pass, and it's going to be a blip. But there are two shareholder proposals here. One, disclosure of regenerative agriculture practices within the supply chain. That's As You Sow on behalf of Warren Wilson College. And a second about plastic packaging from Green Century Capital. And Chantal had a second question, which was, it seems like the shareholder proposals were pretty much dismissed by the board of directors in the AGM. In your opinion, was their reasoning for blocking the proposals reasonable? Has there been an instance where shareholder proposals actually get passed? I'll take the second one first. Do they get passed? Yes, they do, but incredibly rarely, according to Proxy Monitor. 803 shareholder proposals were filed for the largest 250 companies in the U.S. in the last 2 years. Of those, only 21 got more than 50% of the vote. That's a 2.6% passage rate. And those were all pure governance. Special meetings, supermajority voting rules, which usually require even more votes to pass in the first place. So even when they pass the 50% rate, they don't actually pass. In fact, the highest vote-getting environmental proposal in the last 2 years was a 46% yes vote at PACCAR to disclose climate lobbying. These very rarely pass, but they do. And as to dismissal, virtually all of the proposals are usually dismissed by the board by saying one of two things. Either number one, we already do that, or number two, it's not relevant to shareholders at this point. In fact, both of the answers to these shareholder proposals by General Mills are that. Often the pre-proxy fight for a proposal, which is a proposal gets submitted to the companies before it makes it to the proxy, and the companies usually fight to exclude them. It's always around the ordinary business rule, which basically says this happens in the ordinary course of business. Shareholders can't micromanage us. And the difference in sort of the proposals are, we demand you use more electricity from solar, that's micromanaging. But if you say, oh, we demand a report on the sources of your electricity to determine what risks you have of increased costs that could hurt shareholders, that might make it through. So usually there's a framing here. You can't demand a specific thing, but you can demand a broader thing that you frame as risk, which is exactly what we see here. The disclosure on regenerative ag practices from As You Sow proposal focuses on whether or not they want a report that deals with how farmers down the supply chain are limiting pesticide use. And in this case, I actually agree. I want more disclosure around regenerative ag. It's a scientific endeavor. It's not a policy thing. You can measure it with things like soil health, like water absorption rates, chemical composition of soil. And a core part of that is pesticide use. But General Mills says they can't push for that because it's complex, expensive, which they always say. And they also say it would alienate farmers in their supply chain, as in they would be less likely to focus on regenerative ag if they ask for data around regenerative ag. I actually think that's pretty ridiculous. If you can't ask your suppliers to look at how much pesticide they use, then what good is it being General Mills? I mean, if you can't do that, then the pivot might be you need to get vertical. You need to own the farms. Go and buy the farms and then do it. So I'm voting for the first shareholder proposal on regenerative agricultural practices. The second shareholder proposal I'm voting for also, but it's an ask for a report around sustainable packaging. I'm not sure sustainable packaging is a real thing. Green Century is right that General Mills has set all sorts of targets around sustainable packaging. But they want consumers to actually drop their packages back at the store in order to make it sustainable, in order to recycle it. But that's a non-starter. No one's going to do that. Fundamentally, recycling is an economic designation. It's not a materials designation. Most materials can be recycled that aren't because it's a net economic loss. So that ignores, we're totally ignoring the environmental loss, the premium cost to the environment. This won't pass because General Mills has a lot of disclosure around it, and that's what they say. We disclose a lot around this, but I would vote for it anyway. So let's sum up. I'm voting against Steve Odland. I'm voting against Mary Sastra. They have duplicative skills, and they are a feeder system for friends on this board. The board needs to replace them with people who have forward thinking about nutrition, about the long-term effects of something like Ozempic, and we're going into the 21st century of snack food. We don't need to have sugar cereal as our primary delivery system for corn and sugar. I'm voting against CEO pay. I'm voting for regenerative agriculture practices shareholder proposal and for the plastic packaging shareholder proposal. That's it. That's the Proxy Countdown for the week of September 2nd, 2024. Join us next time when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool, forever on the lookout for shareholder sharks, floating band-aids, and wayward